Hello, Riversiders. I'm going to jump right into this one because this is a long unit. I'm not sure we're going to have time. Um, so let's just jump right into genetics, Mendelian genetics. This guy right here, Gregor Mendel, considered the founder of genetics. He was a Czech monk living around the time of the American Civil War. He lived in a monastery and he was playing around with his garden plants, specifically pea plants. He noticed some were tall, some were short, and he decided, what's going to happen if I cross a tall with a short? When he did, he saw something interesting. 100% of the babies were tall. I thought, huh, that's interesting. Then he crossed those babies that were all tall, and 25%, or 1/4 of the offspring, were short again. And that gave rise in his mind, or helped him solidify how genetics works. And so what he realized was that there's traits that you show, he called them the phenotype, and there's what your genes actually say, that's called the genotype. And you have at least 2 copies of every gene. Well, he says you have 2 copies of every gene. A copy is called an allele. So you get 2 alleles for each trait. One you got from mom and one you got from dad. And your genotype is what alleles you have. Your phenotype is what trait you show. And he found that sometimes, he said you could either be homozygous. These are all the darkened terms in this. Homozygous means both your alleles are the same. Or you could be heterozygous, where your alleles are different. You have one that says one thing and one that says something else. And he found that with pea plants, tall is dominant over short. Short he called recessive, because it recedes, it hides behind the dominant tall. So if you were to cross a tall plant and a short plant, every one of the babies would get a tall gene from mom or dad, whichever one was tall, and a short gene from the other parent. And so they're going to be heterozygous, all the babies. But because tall is dominant, the tall will show up. And all the babies will be tall. But if you cross those babies with themselves, with other ones like themselves that are heterozygous, 3 out of the 4 of them will be tall, will have at least one capital T, one bit tall gene, and only 1/4 of them, 1/4 of them, will have the 2 little short genes, and therefore be short. Recessive genes, recessive traits only show up if you're homozygous recessive. So here's his mathematical model of this. Here he is crossing the hybrids, the heterozygous. Here's a heterozygous crossed with a heterozygous, and 3 out of the 4 have a dominant T, the capital letter in this case. Capital is the shorthand for the dominant trait, and 1/4 of them is little t, and it will show the recessive trait. He did this with lots of traits. He found that tall is dominant over short, and I think green is dominant over yellow, and round is dominant over wrinkled. And he found all sorts of different things with pea plants, always playing around with pea plants. Why pea plants? He had a garden he liked to play in. He could control which ones were reproducing with which ones by covering over the flower and using his finger to pollinate, not letting bees pollinate it. Also, their generation time is like 1 year. So in 1 year's time, you can find out what the offspring are going to be. Whereas with a human, our generation time is like 20 years. So to try evolution with humans, besides the ethical issues of it, it would take you a lifetime to do a couple of these crosses. He then found that not every trait is dominant or recessive. Sometimes they blend, and he called that incomplete dominance. Neither completely dominates. They blend. And then he found even some traits both show up. You cross a red flower with a blue flower, and rather than getting a purple or a red or a blue, you get a red and blue flower, maybe speckled, maybe different petals. And so he called those codominant. Codominant and incomplete dominant, we tend to use different letters since neither one dominates over the others. So none of them are going to be little lowercase letters. So this would be an example of incomplete dominance where they blend. This would be an example of codominance where they both show up. More examples. He found that some traits, I don't think he found this, years later, but it's still classified under Mendelian genetics. We've found some traits are linked that are on the X chromosome. So we call them sex-linked because, as I'm sure you've learned in class by now, the X and Y chromosomes are called the sex chromosomes, and they determine whether you make whether you have a penis and make a lot of testosterone, or whether you have a vagina and make a lot of estrogen. It's true there are exceptions. There are things that mess with this, and it's not necessarily your gender, but we found that traits that are on this X, this little leg of the X, the people who have a Y don't have a second copy of those genes. They only get the one from mom. Dad gave them a Y. They don't have that second leg. And therefore, any trait that's on here, on that little leg that guys only have one copy of, is called sex-linked. They're much more likely to show those traits because they only have one copy. So it's linked to what sex you are, and it's on the sex chromosome, and all that good stuff. The last thing is what's called a pedigree. This is pedigree. I will post a second video just on how to do pedigrees. Actually, I'll post a video on how to do Punnett squares as well. But yeah, we can trace traits. Looking at this trait, you know that it has to be recessive because this person shows it and neither parent has it, so it had to have hidden. You can, so if it's recessive, you know that that's going to be little, and everybody who doesn't have it is going to have at least one capital, and then you can figure out, well, this person must have a little hiding because they were able to pass a little on to this baby. Both these people must have a little hiding because they were able to pass a little on to this baby. All these people are little. The only ones we don't know about are these two. I'll have examples of this in class. That's Mendelian genetics, really quick nutshell, in the interest of making sure that this is less than 15 minutes and postable onto YouTube. I'm going to end here. I will catch you in the next one. Bye, guys.